This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review with Gilad Halpern.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host Gilad Halpern, and every week I'll be engaging in close encounters of the intellectual kind with writers and scholars, or simply people of ideas of all types and vocations who have done something to make our lives a tad more interesting. My guest today is a historian of British Jewry, the founding director of the charity Jewish Heritage UK, and author of several books, including most recently Jewish Heritage in Britain and Ireland, an architectural guide. Joining us now on the line from the UK is Dr. Shalman Kaddish. Hello, Shalman, and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Oh, hello.
So Jewish people from really across the English-speaking world are often lumped together under the category of Anglo-Jews, and that is, of course, erroneous, because on the face of it, Anglo-Jews are Jewish people from England. Anyway, what I'd like to focus on today in our discussion is British Jews who aren't English Jews, that is, Jews from the other regions that make up the United Kingdom, like Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Now, according to your experience and research, what would you say are the main differences between them and the proper Anglo-Jews, that is, Jews from England?
Well, I would say, that was the first wasn't it? I would say that actually there really is very little difference between Anglo-Jews in England and in the rest of the UK, and even in Ireland, both North and South, the Republic of Ireland, because culturally they belong to the same community, and irrespective of the political divisions in the UK and in Ireland, which have changed in the past and may change again in the future, particularly in relation to Scotland.
So would you say that Jews in these regions are perhaps the long arm of England in this sense?
I would say so, yes, because culturally, the majority of Jews in Britain came from Europe. Going back, for a little bit of a history lesson, if we go back to the modern Jewish communities, started in the 17th century, the official Jewish community, from what we call the resettlement, which was the readmission, supposedly, of the Jews to England in 1656 under Oliver Cromwell. In fact, it's all a little bit of a misnomer, because there was never an official readmission. Jews just sort of came back. Because, don't forget, there was a medieval community in England.
That was expelled. That was expelled.
Was expelled, and in fact, England has the distinction, the dubious distinction of being the first country, first of all, to expel its Jews in the first kind of recorded expulsion in Europe in 1290 under Edward I. And before that was the first country that where the blood libel first occurred. Again, the first documented blood libel case took place in Norwich in East Anglia in 1144. So that's a sort of a dubious record, which not a lot of people know about.
Yeah.
But anyway, Jews came back in the 17th century with Cromwell, basically to London and also to Dublin in Ireland, which of course then was part of Britain. The origins of the communities were very much the same. The early settlers came from Amsterdam, were Sephardim, who'd originally, been thrown out of Spain with the expulsion we're talking about 1492 when Columbus sailed the ocean blue. I'm sure people are familiar with that history.
And that's right.
Some Jews moved northwards, some Sephardim, and ended up in Amsterdam, and it's really in Amsterdam where the history of British Jewry, of Anglo-Jewry, starts. So the original immigrants were Spanish and Portuguese. From the 17th century onwards, the Sephardi community that founded.
Why Amsterdam? What happened in Amsterdam that really gave the impetus to Anglo-Jewry?
Well, the impetus was because Holland was, a great trading nation, a maritime nation, and was fairly tolerant towards Jews relative to other European countries. You know, when people lived in ghettos in Europe, in most parts of Europe, both, the Sephardim certainly lived in ghettos in southern Europe, and the Ashkenazim, of course, in Central and Eastern Europe, were living in Jewish quarters in towns, maybe not actually walled ghettos, but were subject to all sorts of restrictions.
Yeah.
So whereas in Holland, it was a more tolerant environment. Once the Protestants came to power and the Spanish were thrown out, because don't forget that Holland had been a colony of Spain, so it was under the Inquisition until the 16th century.
And how did that spill over to the United Kingdom?
Well, Jews from Amsterdam were extremely, like Jews everywhere, were extremely mobile people. And so they were trading with England and, of course, with the colonies as well. And the Dutch, the whole of the history of the Western Sephardim, the Jewish community strung out along the Atlantic seaboard and right over to the United States, basically founded a lot of the colonies in West Indian Islands and Curacao and Suriname, all these places right across the Atlantic, originated in Northern Europe. Right. Jews who were expelled from Spain went trading. I mean, Christopher Columbus was supposed to have had some Jews. He may have even been a Jew himself, a Marano, a secret, converso. Yeah. And there were supposedly Jews in England in the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, that one of her doctors,
who settled,
Dr. Lopez, yes.
And they settled mainly in and around London.
In London. So we're talking about London, but actually Dublin in the 17th century also had, we think, a small Sephardi community which died out. And then Dublin in the 18th century, Jews came again from Europe.
Right.
So Sephardim were very mobile people, and they travelled sometimes backwards and forwards across the Atlantic. I mean, we're talking on Skype and we've got the internet and everything. But I mean, this is people going by sailing ship across, oceans in sort of,
So the first Anglo-Jews, as you said, well, the latest incarnation of Anglo-Jews were in London around the time of Elizabeth I in the 17th century. How did they start spreading to the rest of the country, all the way up to Scotland and westward to Wales?
Right, sort of the settlement pattern. Well, basically what happens in the end of the 17th century, and in fact became really aware of this when we were doing our original survey of the Jewish built heritage in the UK and Ireland, because we looked at material heritage culture, Jewish heritage, all over the country. And the older communities of places we started off with were mostly in the south of England and in the West Country, Cornwall and Devon and the southern seaports, because Jews came in as immigrants through the seaports.
Yeah.
So ports and naval towns, places like Portsmouth, which was the oldest Jewish community outside London on the UK mainland.
Interesting.
And, across to Cornwall, and there's quite a romantic kind of history about the Jews in Cornwall. There are all sorts of myths associated with it. There's a town called Marazion, which there's a mythological idea that it comes from Sion. That it was sort of an outpost of Zion.
Yeah, so the first Zionists actually lived in Cornwall.
Sorry?
The first Zionists actually lived in Cornwall.
I mean, the Irish also claim that they're the lost Jews as well, the 10 lost tribes. So there are all kinds of myths, Gaelic myths and things. But there are certainly Jews living in Cornwall in the 18th century. And again, they came for trade reasons to Penzance and Falmouth, as traders, and then gradually moved inland, so to places like Exeter. And then further up, Bristol was a big trading port as well, of course, made its wealth on the slave trade. So Jews were involved in the less sort of the more dubious aspect of of colonial history, of the Jews involved in empire and empire building, and so the trade between, for example, Jamaica and Bristol was very significant, and that sort of enriched Bristol and the merchants and seamen in Bristol. And then gradually moving inland, again, the east coast of England, East Anglia, some of the oldest communities, in fact, the relics of medieval Anglo-Jewry, stone houses, for example, which were built associated with Jewish moneylenders, because don't forget, in the Middle Ages, Jews were restricted by the church, by the Catholic Church,
Sure.
to certain jobs. And of course, Christians weren't allowed to lend on interest. But of course, kings and princes and bishops and what have you still had to raise capital for their wars, not least. And so they were turned to the Jewish moneylenders. Mm-hmm. And so it was Jews were associated with money lending and built stone houses as security, because when the king and the barons got into debt, during the Crusades and things, they would go and burn down the Jew's house and burn all the financial records.
Right.
So make a pogrom.
Mm-hmm.
So
these houses were revived along with the
the Jews' houses are. I'm just saying that there are medieval traces of medieval Anglo Jewry in places like Norwich and Lincoln on the East Coast. But going back to the modern Anglo-Jewish
I'd like to know how they made the way all the way up to Scotland.
Scotland?
The origins of Scottish Jewry.
Of Scottish Jewry? Ah, right, Scotland. Well, actually, we're sort of moving up the UK, because if you think of the geography of Britain, it's an island, or rather 2 islands, if you include Ireland. And so Jews came from Europe from the east, across the Channel and across the North Sea. So the early immigrants, in the medieval period, Jews came from Rouen in northern France with William the Conqueror in 1066. And in the modern period, Jews came again, from Amsterdam across the North Sea. And then later on, as the century progressed, the 17th and the 18th century, Ashkenazim started coming from places like Hamburg and the northern German ports, because Hamburg was a big entrepot, I suppose is the word, and Bremen, and then from Ashkenazi Central Europe, from the Rhineland area, across the Baltic and the North Sea, from all the way over from Poland and the Baltic states. Mm-hmm. So, and then moving, people came over the mass migration, of which most of today's Jewish community are descendants of. Probably, about 80% of the community can trace their origins to the mass migration after 1881 in the Russian Empire, and that was, of course, the biggest migration of Jews in history, basically, and one of the biggest migrations in the world, really, I suppose, until the Second World War, and and what's happening today, from the Middle East and North Africa.
Yeah. Which also gave rise, of course, to the American Jewish community.
Yes, yeah. Basically, the American Jews and the British Jews, Anglo Jewry, the Irish Jews, all come from the same Shtetlach in Lithuania and Poland and Ukraine, and it's all the same gene pool, if you like, of people. Mm-hmm. And they became the dominant communities in Western Europe, and particularly, obviously, in Britain and America, which weren't affected by the Second World War and the Shoah. So the communities survived, and the other community that has survived on the continent of Europe unscathed, of course, is Gibraltar, which has very strong links with Britain. Mm-hmm. So because it's a British Crown colony.
Are they also considered Anglo-Jews?
Well, not really. That's very interesting. There's another layer of identity there. Yeah. They're very patriotic. They regard themselves as British, or even though they all speak Spanish. It's very strange. They're bilingual, but they are extremely patriotic, and they don't want to return to Spanish rule. They want to stay British. In fact, they're probably more patriotic than the British government is. So,
how many Jews are there in Gibraltar? What's the size of the community?
It's at least 600. It's probably the community is growing.
Oh, it's actually pretty big.
Yes,
for such a small place.
It's only about 3 miles across Gibraltar. We did a project there, which was a spin-off of the Survey of the Jewish Heritage, because when we published the original guidebook in 2006, which was the first ever guidebook to sort of architectural heritage of Jews in Britain, the funders, we had a grant from the Heritage Lottery Fund, which is basically, it's UK-based, but we had funding, I think, from the London office, and they wouldn't allow us to use the funding for travel expenses in Ireland, in the Republic, or in the Isle of Man or the Channel Islands. And so when we decided we were going to do Gibraltar, they said, "Oh, very sorry, you'll have to, do separate fundraising and make a separate publication."
Because it was only for England.
Yeah, and English Heritage, which was the government conservation body who supported our work, is now being renamed Historic England. Mm-hmm. But their jurisdiction is only England, as the name suggests.
Right.
So we had to call the guidebook Jewish Heritage in England.
In England.
And then what we did was we sort of sneaked in Scotland and Wales and Ireland at the back, but we didn't have any photos. Or I think we have one picture from Glasgow, Garner Hill Synagogue in Glasgow.
Right.
And so with the second edition and the name change and a new publishing manager, they sort of changed their policy. And they said, OK, in fact, it might be more interest abroad if we actually change the title to reflect the content.
Mm-hmm. And that came out last
Jewish
year.
Heritage in Britain and Ireland.
Yeah.
But the Gibraltar project was published separately.
Yeah, but
so there were two guidebooks.
If we spend some more time on the actual book, what can you tell us really about the main features, architectural features of British Jewry?
Architectural features. Well, actually, I suppose I have to plug my other book, won't I? I've also written a book on the synagogues of Britain and Ireland, an architectural and social history, which was published by Yale in 2011, and that's really kind of much more about that sort of question, because it's an architectural history book. So it's, I suppose, a more academic book, art history kind of book. And I trace the history of synagogue architecture and relating it to the social development of the community from the 17th century up to the present day. And it's a big coffee table book with lots of pictures in it. So that's quite complicated. But the guidebook is about, basically, it is divided into regions, and it's geared to tourism. So if people want to visit a particular region of the UK, including London, then they can look up the guidebook, which is divided up into regions. And each region starts with a particular site. We have a lead site. So in London, for example, in fact, we have London's divided into two regions, because perhaps I should say that about 2/3 of Anglo Jewry, however we define that, have always been living in the London area, right throughout in the medieval period and in the modern period.
To this day.
So you've got the most Jewish sites in London, much more than anywhere else.
Sure.
So we've got two chapters on London in the guidebook, one on the East End and one on the West End.
And really, what are the defining features that are really unique to Britain, to Jewish life in Britain?
Do you mean about architecture or
Yes.
about people? Or
No, the architecture.
I would say it's not. It actually has a lot in common with other countries on the continent, actually. And of course, when I was researching what I call my big book, the Yale book, I was amazed at how much. I had to look at background. What was synagogue architecture like in Europe, in different parts of Europe, in the Sephardi and the Ashkenazi world. And then certainly in the 19th century, Britain was part of the whole emancipation thing, because the Jews were emancipated in Britain, which makes it a bit different. I suppose England and Holland, or Britain, I would say, actually it was England, I suppose, initially, and Holland, the Netherlands, were a bit different from the rest of Europe, because the Jews were emancipated earlier on. And in England, it was very much a sort of a process over time where Jews gained sort of civil rights before they got political emancipation.
Right.
And political emancipation was really achieved, or the official date is 1858, in the reign of Queen Victoria, when Lionel de Rothschild, who was one of the Rothschild banking family, he was elected to be MP for the City of London, and he wasn't allowed to take up his seat in the House of Commons. I think 5 times he was elected, because he had to swear an oath, and it was the oath of abjuration, it was called, on the true faith of a Christian. And that basically excluded anyone, not only anyone who wasn't, basically all Christians other than Anglicans, because the Church of England was the established church, it still is. So anybody who isn't an Anglican, and that includes obviously Catholics and what we call nonconformists or dissenters, like Baptists and Wesleyans and Methodists and all sorts of low church groups, were excluded from Parliament because and from all sorts of public office in the 19th century because of this oath, which is basically you had to be a signed-up member of the Anglican Church in order to sit in Parliament. And then people say, when I teach this stuff, I used to teach modern Jewish history, people say, but Disraeli, he was a Jewish Prime Minister, wasn't he? Benjamin Disraeli. So you have to say, he was born a Jew, but his father was a member of the Bevis-Mark Synagogue, which was it is the oldest synagogue in Britain, on the edge of the City of London, the Sephardi synagogue. And he had a row, a broigus, if you understand Yiddish, with the Mahamad, the council of the synagogue, and he left. And he had all his children baptised into the Church of England. Mm-hmm. So Benjamin was an Anglican. Mm-hmm. So although, of course, everybody thinks he's Jewish, and he was halakhically Jewish, he was an Anglican in terms of his religious confession. So there was no impediment to him becoming Prime Minister. Mm. But anyway, going back to Lionel de Rothschild, so he was granted the right to sit in Parliament in 1858 as a practising Jew. So, as a Jew by faith.
Yeah, Sharman, I'm afraid we're quickly running out of time. So I'd like just to ask you one last question about the current projects that you've undertaken with the Jewish Heritage UK. What are your plans for the near future?
Well, Jewish Heritage UK is a charity which we set up in 2004, which is dedicated. It's the only body within the British Anglo-Jewish community which is a professional body providing support to synagogue organisations and congregations who are custodians of historic buildings and sites, including synagogues and cemeteries. And so we assist them in looking after the historic buildings, especially listed synagogues, which are major sites around the country.
How many are there?
How many are there? There are about 40 listed synagogues, of which a few less than that. It depends how you count them, because some of them are no longer in use. But it's between 30 and 40 synagogues. And, of course, one of our aims is to keep synagogues in use. Mm-hmm. And one of the challenges that we face, which, again, we have in common with American communities, for example, is that the synagogues, certainly the Victorian ones in the 19th century, were built in city centres. And the congregations were suburbanised. Mm-hmm. So there was a question of redundancy, that this building is no longer fit for purpose, there aren't enough members, let's close it down. But of course, we're talking about major buildings. Yeah. And Bevis Marks faced this problem in the 19th century, in the 1880s, when the wealthy Sephardim moved out of the city and the East End and moved all the way over to Bayswater and Maida Vale. And there was a bit of a long schlep from Bayswater and Maida Vale to Bevis Marks. Yeah. So they wanted to pull the building down and build a new synagogue in Maida Vale, which eventually they did. Well, they built the new synagogue, but Bevis Marks, and there was a big campaign, which was called the Bevis Marks Anti-Demolition League, which was the first conservation movement in Anglo-Jewry.
Way before Jewish Heritage UK was set up.
Sorry, we were set up in 2004, but we feel that we follow in these footsteps of the Anti-Demolition League, which resulted in the foundation of the Jewish Historical Society of England. Right. So we've got a sort of a long, but it's tough in the present economic climate with anything to do with heritage and conservation, because we're working in a climate of recession, and economic problems. Yeah. So, and there's been huge government cuts from people like Historic England. The Heritage Lottery Fund is still going, but there's a lot less money around. So we're looking for regeneration and of sites.
I hope that people will really come round and realise how important your work is.
I hope so too.
Yeah. Okay, Dr. Shalman.
Is that enough information for you?
Yes, absolutely. Yes. Dr. Shalman Kaddish, a historian of British Jewry, the founding director of Jewish Heritage UK, and an expert on Jewish heritage in Britain. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Oh, thanks.
That brings us to the end of our show today. Thank you very much for listening. Also, big thanks to Alex Benish, the technical producer of this show. I'm Gilad Halpern, signing off here in Tel Aviv. Do join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.
כשיהיה גדול יהיה נגר ובני בתים אבל לא כלוב כשיהיה גדול יהיה זמר והשיר שיר שמח למי שעצוב כשיהיה גדול יהיה רופא שנותן זריקות לכל מי שכואב כשיהיה גדול